Well, welcome to a new Dave's Workshop Tours video and to part 2 of my visit to Grand Tourer. Last week, General Manager David showed us around the XB Coupe and we saw the install of its Cleveland 351 V8 engine. This week, it's all about the previous generation of Ford's Australian icon. Next to the coupe is a red pepper XA GT sedan, the first iteration of the third generation Falcon produced between 1972 and 73. Design assistance came from global headquarters in Detroit.
It's a automatic power steering, air conditioning, power windows, front and rear spoiler, black trim. It's at a similar stage to the XB Coupe. We should have the motor ready for that in a couple of weeks, and it's probably in a similar position. We're not far off fitting up the dash and continuing on with the interior and the glass. Yeah, it's coming up very nicely. This was another car that the customer organised his own bodywork, but we sort of worked in conjunction with the panel beater, and the guy that did the bodywork on it has done a very nice job, but he does a lot of hot rod work and not necessarily muscle car work, so he was quite keen to work with us and have us guide him on how to actually do the car. One of the traps that people fall into with these cars from a bodywork point of view is they can end up with way too much material on them, and they can look too thick, too heavy. You start to lose the definition of some of the body lines. So once again, the skill set of the panel beater is they've got to use modern materials but make it look like it was painted back in the 70s. And back in the 70s, the manufacturers, being as tight as they were, tried to use the least amount of material as possible, and they were using acrylics and enamels, not 2-pack and high fill primers. So it's a real skill set to use modern materials and get them looking similar to how they were built back in the day.
The changes, would that be something that occurred every year?
No, but you might have, this is known as an XA. The cars continue to evolve. So for argument's sake, XAs are known from an ID tag point of view as big tag cars and twin tag cars. There was changes in things like 72 cars had if they were black trim, they had a black headlining, and 73 cars, there was a changeover and they went to a white headlining. So once again, it's having the knowledge and understanding of the car and getting some data on the car to know how it actually left the production line, because it's very easy to almost misbuild or misrestore the car with wrong components that match the month and year of the car. And in a lot of instances, it costs us the same money to do it the right way as the wrong way. So doing the research and having the knowledge, which is where Dan's skill set comes in and is invaluable, is key to, once again, making sure that we build the car correctly to maintain its value.
And this would be presumably a classic case of race on Sunday, sell on Monday with this kind of model.
Yeah, very much, very much. Yeah, there's lots of people who've got fascinating stories about their dad had one, and they used to watch Bathurst with their dad as kids, or go to Bathurst, and these cars were sort of iconic and a lot of fond memories for families. And in some instances, Dad had one back in the day, so I want one, or it's been handed down, or
presumably more sales achievable in a sedan than in a coupe?
The coupe was raced, but it came online later. And this era of car, as everybody knows, with the Supercar Scare, there was supposed to be a Phase 4 version of the XA, and even though there was, the program got canned and they never officially hit the racetrack from a bitumen point of view. One car was rallied, which would be a bit of a monster, and it was a red car, but I think it was Brambles red from memory, one of the Phase 4s, and that'd be a wild thing to see flying through the bush in the wee hours of the morning, throwing rocks everywhere. But yeah, and then they
just elaborate a little on the Supercar Scare.
And my understanding of it was that Ford were bringing out the Phase 4 to supersede the Phase 3, and it was going to be a more finely refined car again than an XY, and more power again, and they were claiming, potentially the media was claiming cars capable of 160 mile an hour, and The way that the motorsport rules were written in the day, you had to build a minimum number of cars to qualify to be able to race the cars, and Ford were all geared up and ready to go, as was Holden with a V8 LJ Tourer, as was Chrysler with a E55 340 Charger. And then there was a politician and a journalist out of Sydney, I think Evan Green, that broke the story that the manufacturers were going to build these cars, and basically they went to the manufacturers and said, if you build these cars, we'll cancel all of our fleet contracts because we're not having you release these weapons to the public. So manufacturers being manufacturers and relying heavily on fleet business, which could have been up to, I think, back in the day, 70% of their overall business, they killed the programs overnight.
Wow.
So Ford, I believe, it's rumoured that they had all the part sets all ready to go, and when the program was killed, some of those components were filtered into standard production vehicles, yeah, the program quietly went away.
Did any actual cars make it onto the market?
Once again, I don't claim to be an expert on this subject, but my understanding is that one official vehicle went down the line, which was a green XA sedan, which is based out of Sydney and still exists. And as far as I know, it's the only one that's actually officially plated as a Phase 4. There was 3 race cars built up or in various stages of being built. Those cars came off the line as standard GTs and were built into Phase 4 spec race cars, but as the program was cancelled, they never officially hit the racetrack. I believe some of those cars still exist. Yeah, and the program was to continue, and I believe there was going to be a Phase 5, which would have been a coupe, but yeah, I think once it all happened, then the manufacturers went back to CAMS, Confederation of Motorsport, and basically they came up with a new set of rules where they didn't basically have to build these cars to a spec down the production line to qualify for racing. So it sort of went away as being a problem for the manufacturers.
Okay, Dave, what have we got here on the floor?
So we've laid out the components that have got to go inside the car. This car's at a very similar stage to the XB Coupe. We're not far off putting the dash in the car, so you can see crash pads, vent ducting and the likes. And then yeah, the next thing on this particular car, we'll be building up the doors and fitting the glass. We'll be fitting reproduction glass into this car because the original glass is in reasonably poor condition. So yeah, once we get the dash built up, we're not far off fitting up the front and rear screens and the balance of the interior. The seats in this car were in very good condition, so we haven't had to do much work to the seats or the door trims. The driver's seat frame was a little bit bent, so we've stripped that seat and repaired and straightened up the frame and replaced a few little components here and there. The seat belts were in pretty good condition. They've been done before, but we have re-zinc plated some of the hardware just to bring it up to a standard. So in some instances with the full restorations, if a customer's got a car that's in good condition or they've already commenced part of the restoration, doesn't automatically mean that we've got to restore everything. It may mean that we've got to tweak some stuff just to bring it up to a high level. But in other instances, it could be XAs and Bs are notorious for having a mismatch of interior door handles. So it's just a matter of picking through all the components and making sure everything is as per what is correct for that model.
So you've got some pretty special looking wheels on both these cars, David. Where do they come from?
So the globe wheels are pretty iconic with GTs, and they were originally developed to be, they were supposed to come out on the Phase 4 race cars on the XAs, but when the program was canned, Ford continued on with racing the XYs, and the GTHOs, I believe the customers back in the day were sent or offered a set of globe wheels so that Ford could continue on racing the XYs until the XA coupes came online, or hardtops, depending on which camp you go to. And by doing that, they dramatically reduced the unsprung weight from a racing point of view and dropped the brake temperatures considerably due to the design of the wheel. Excuse me, the wheels then became an option on XAs, Bs and through to the XC Cobras and even the XD ESPs. So they continued on as a genuine piece for quite some time. Neil Thompson, the original owner of our business, had the foresight a long time ago to approach Globe back in the day when they still existed as a company in South Australia, and we ended up with the tooling for the wheels, and yeah, since then we've manufactured a couple of runs of wheels based on the original design. There's a few different manufacturers in the marketplace, but we've had our wheels pretty heavily scrutinised by our team, and attention to detail wise, we believe our wheels are probably about as close as you can get to the original style wheel. The guys that are restoring original cars or building really high-end replica cars acknowledge and agree that, that from an attention to detail point of view, that our wheels are probably one of the better ones in the marketplace.
Okay, so what have we got behind you?
So the car on the hoist is a white XW. It's a Cleveland car. Gentleman purchased that probably 3 or 4 months ago from an auction, and it came in for a basic check over and a roadworthy. It's been built up in the late 80s, early 90s, and it's got the treatment that they did back around that era, so there's lots of things under the bonnet are being chromed, and the suspension's been slammed on the ground, and aftermarket Simmons wheels, and look, I'm sure it was a nice thing back in its day, but as we put together a list of items that it needed for a roadworthy, we also floated the idea that because of some of the items that needed to be fixed for a roadworthy, that if the customer was going to return it to somewhere along its original lines, that now would be a good opportunity to do that. So we've stripped the engine bay and the front suspension. We're going to do a full restoration on the engine bay and detail the motor up. So we'll return it to presenting similar to its original style. We'll put it's an early Cleveland car, so it's got 12 slaughter wheels on it. So we'll put a set of 12 slaughters back on it, bring the ride height back up to somewhere near original, redo the blackouts on the car because some of them are a bit too glossy, and yeah, it's not a car that needs a full restoration, but it'll respond very well to a tidy up. So we'll do some of the interior, bring the dash fascia back up, re-chrome some of the trim on the interior, the mouldings on the door trims, and it'll just come up as a nice high-end driver. And you can see that there's aftermarket stereos and Simmons wheels and components that have been painted over when the car's been resprayed before, and lowered springs and big sway bars and all stuff that was pretty cool back in the day, but it's now not what we tend to do with these cars because of the value of the cars, and people are trying to return them back to similar to what they were in the factory. So this car should respond and come up quite nicely, but yeah, it's a bit of a time warp. It came in caught in the late 80s, early 90s, and we're slowly returning it back to the early 70s. So
I suppose there's going to come a time though in time to come when there's going to be a bit of nostalgia for those 80s or modded 90s modded cars, I guess.
It's a bit of a in some instances we have situations where customers want to retain some of that, and even from a suspension point of view, like we might fit aftermarket coil springs and lower the car slightly, and we might do shock absorber upgrades and things like that. But what we can do is we can paint them and detail them as per what the factory components were. So even though the car sits a bit lower and handles a bit better, the shock absorbers might be painted in the correct colour, they might have the correct washers and nuts on them, the springs are being painted black and got the correct colour code markings on them, things like that. So once again, we can work with the customer and try and find a balance between the two. Not to say that we've never put a set of aftermarket wheels on a car either. So it comes down to recognising what the customer wants and trying to work with him or her to find a balance between the two.
Well,
mate. It's been a great walk around and informative. Somebody from the Northern Hemisphere that's only recently come across these cars and whatever, but yeah, they're certainly iconic, and certainly talking to people, you know what sort of effect they've had on the Australian public. And yeah, long to see these finished, and thanks for letting us come along, and I hope to see them rolling out the door, I guess.
More than welcome, and it's been a pleasure having you here.